General Petraeus, just an honor, a real honor to have you back here at the Reagan Library. We couldn't ask for more, and the fact that you visited during the Reagan Defense Forum is a big deal for us for those. So thank you for coming.
Oh, it's a privilege to be back. I mean it.
General, we're here at the Reagan Library, and as you know, there's so much history, and there's personal history on your part, having been involved in the military right from the start of the Reagan days. And I wondered if you just would take us back and tell us where were you in those moments of the famous Reagan years, and how'd you find your way through the military during that period? And from there, I just want to ask you about a question that relates more to the modern day.
Sure. Well, I was in a mechanized infantry division when the Reagan administration commenced, and we saw very quickly the commitment to rebuild American defense capabilities. I went to the Command and General Staff College for a year, and we studied this and all of the various components of the Reagan, what came to be known as the Reagan Buildup, the big ideas that he brought into office that I think were so very powerful. Peace through strength, of course. It seems very simplistic and it seems very obvious, but it wasn't obvious at the time, and it was very powerful and profound. So were other concepts like, don't trust, verify, and all the rest of this, but also a willingness to sit down with one's biggest superpower rival in what was then very much a bipolar world, a world divided between East and West, the United States and its allies and coalitions, and of course the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, and its various partners. I then actually went to graduate school at Princeton. It was a very interesting time because during that time, Reagan was not wildly popular on some college campuses and indeed in some sectors of our country. The invasion of Grenada was undertaken during that time. It was a success, but not an unqualified military success in every respect. There were shortcomings that were identified in joint forces, in our special operating force capabilities, and all the rest. It also, frankly, there was a close call when it came to international law and sort of the norms of, quote, just war, and all of this which I was studying. In fact, I wrote a paper during that time for one of the leading international lawyers of the world and also the leading opponent of the war in Vietnam, Professor Richard Falk. And the title of the paper was The Invasion of Grenada, Illegal, Immoral, and the Right Thing to Do. And he actually gave it an A+ and wanted me to be his teaching assistant. But in any event, so we continued with that. I did a dissertation on the U.S. military and the lessons of Vietnam. And again, that was influenced not just by the fact that we were at the 10-year mark from the end of Vietnam, but that we were starting to re-examine those lessons in ways that the very simplistic lessons of no more Vietnams, no more irregular warfare, no more ground wars on Asian soil, et cetera, were starting to be re-examined. And that process, the intellectual capital, I guess, and also the intellectual humility I developed at grad school during that time, I think was very helpful years later. I then went and taught at West Point international relations and economics and international security issues, and indeed spent a summer working for the Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Southern Command, General Jack Galvin, as his special assistant, and arrived there to find in the very first briefing, I realized the morning update, this is a region, a theater at war. We were supporting in a somewhat quiet way the 55-man limit in El Salvador as it was fighting a very tough insurgency and eventually crafted a very comprehensive civil military campaign on which I drew in later years in Iraq and in Afghanistan. It was where we were, on another hand, supporting the insurgents, the Contras out of Honduras. And I remember going in there, and there were some sort of dark meetings at night and this kind of thing. And then, of course, we were supporting Colombia against the FARC, Peru against the Sendero Luminoso, other countries as they were trying to come to grips with governance and concepts of democracy and so forth. I remember that, the general who was in charge in Panama, of course, later years when I was the aide to the chief of staff of the Army, we took that regime down. And then went to support General Galvin when he became the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, the NATO commander in Europe, as his special assistant again. And that was the year of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. And now, based on this strength that we'd developed, based on a willingness to engage with our adversary, the Soviet Union, all of a sudden you have an agreement on what was a very destabilizing development, the deployment on each side of the Iron Curtain of these shorter range nuclear weapons, and an agreement to do away with them. And I remember some fascinating, this is sort of exhilarating stuff for a young major to be writing for the Supreme Allied Commander and doing the briefings and talking points for meetings with the president in the cabinet room and testimony before Senate Armed Services Committee as a single individual. He wouldn't have any civilians because he was there, even though he was testifying as a U.S. four-star, as Commander-in-Chief of U.S. European Command. The truth was he was there because he also was pretty close to the NATO commander. That was his dual hat. And that was a fascinating year again. And then from there, went to be the operations officer of a mechanized infantry battalion that was fairly close to the inter-German border. And the last year of the really big Reforger exercises, in fact, it was the largest in history, and in some ways may have conveyed the capability that the U.S. and the NATO alliance now had, and had it perhaps yet another effect, perhaps was another factor in the ultimate decisions that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, of the Warsaw Pact, and of course of the coming down of the wall, all of which took place later under President George H.W. Bush, having served for 8 years as Reagan's vice president.
Right.
So it was a fascinating period. And again, I keep coming back to the big ideas that Reagan clung to. He arrived with those. He was in some cases criticized for what seemed to be simplistic ideas, and yet they were hugely powerful big ideas when they were operationalized relentlessly, but in a very happy, seemingly happy-go-lucky, cheerful way, but determined to get those done, and he did.
Yeah, that was Ronald Reagan. General, especially those years, 86, 87, all the way through 89, as you were just describing, and you were in great support of the efforts that led to the INF Treaty and, as you say, eventually the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, life has changed dramatically since then, and I know that our military stance and objectives and, frankly, the whole world has changed dramatically, and you faced a certain set of challenges during the Cold War that required the United States military to have certain operational capability. And I wonder now, a couple of decades later, especially as you sit at the Reagan Forum and speak on the panels as you have, how do you see the military's challenges having changed? It seems to me that by what we just heard this morning, that the Cold War might have been tough, but it seems like it might have been just cookies compared to the multi-level, multifaceted, power-centered world that we now face. And that's why if you could talk about that, that'd be terrific to give your contrast.
Well, I think that we are faced by what is the most complex array of challenges that we've seen certainly since the end of the Cold War. And indeed, one can say, that bipolarity wasn't all that tough. And,
right.
Oh, by the way, what the military was asked to do was largely military stuff, offense and defense. I mean, it was not irregular warfare, although, to be fair, let's not forget that there were irregular conflicts going on throughout Latin America, in parts of Africa, in parts of the Asia Pacific as well. Nonetheless, this array of challenges is really quite extraordinary, and it requires capabilities not just at the high end, which we focused on, of course, in the face-off across the Iron Curtain, in so-called traditional major combat operations, offense and defense. But also in the conduct of regular warfare, you add the tasks of stability operations as well, sometimes referred to as nation building, sometimes derisively, because we really want to do nation building at home, understandably, rather than lots of nation building overseas. And I think we actually have evolved. We've actually, in a fairly revolutionary manner, figured out how to do this in a way that is much less costly in terms of blood and treasure, and therefore much more sustainable, which is hugely important because we are in the struggle of a generation against the Islamist extremists, not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. Having said that, we also have to refurbish and improve our capabilities to engage in combat with potential high capability forces, so-called near-peer competitors, with the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, Iranian aggressive actions throughout the Middle East, and indeed the nuclearized North Korea, which is ever more threatening, it seems, with each passing month. And this all takes place in a context that can be described as the great power rivalry era once again. So we are back into that kind of situation rather than the context that we enjoyed for a good 20 to 25 years following the fall of the wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the collapse of that system as a viable system of governance and economics, and the defeat of what at the time I think was the third largest army in the world, Saddam's army, which we turned into the fifth or sixth largest in about a 100-hour period of the ground offensive. And there was no question that the United States stood preeminent during that subsequent 2+ decades, but that now we've gradually returned to an era of great power rivalries. And that has enormous consequences and implications for our forces. And it also means that there is a competitive system that has evolved. And though we may not approve or applaud the abridgment of some of the freedoms, say in China, and the way the economy is managed in some respects, although there's certainly the emergence of very innovative, entrepreneurial, competitive market economic forces, albeit with a lot of state-owned enterprises, and very much an almost increasingly authoritarian state with the consolidation of power in President Xi following the 19th Party Congress. Now he is the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao, following whom there was always an effort to have a bit more of consensus as the norm rather than all powers consolidated in the hands of one individual, especially after the experience with the Cultural Revolution under Mao. So I've actually encouraged, for example, in some of the old departments where I taught at West Point or the City University of New York or at the University of Southern California and up at Harvard, that we need to revive the study of comparative politics. That went away. Again, at the end of the Cold War, we won. The Hegelian dialect was over. As Francis Frank Fukuyama wrote, we had the end of history. And again, we prevailed. Now, maybe not so. We prevailed for 20 or 25 years, but now the rise of China, which China would, I think, see as the return of China to its rightful place in the world after a century of humiliation. But this is more the tradition as they see it. And indeed, we are going to have to manage that relationship very carefully because it's the most important in all of those in the world. But this period, the complexity, the demands on our forces to be capable of everything from relatively speaking low end, although there's nothing low if you're on the receiving end of just even a single AK-47, all the way up to major combat operations, which could encompass now warfare in cyberspace, outer space, as well as ground, air, and sea, and subsea. So a period of enormous intellectual challenge, I think, as well as just capability challenges, because we have to, again, get the big ideas right. We have to understand and acknowledge that we have to be capable of all of these different types of operations in many different climates and parts of the world and circumstances, from the Hindu Kush to the Jazeera Desert of Western Iraq.
Yeah, it's almost hard to imagine you'd say, but it's almost like as though we could pine away for the days of the Cold War.
Well, in some ways, it was very straightforward. And by the way, from a military perspective, there are big forces, big budgets, big commands,
Big tanks.
and you never fought. So in some ways, it was the best of all worlds. You could justify great budgets and capabilities and again, command opportunities without ever having to actually employ them against those we were seeking to deter. And indeed, of course, that was a success. Again, to win the Cold War, to prevail without firing around, this is what Sun Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, proclaimed, that the greatest of victories is that which is achieved without firing a single. He didn't say a single round, but a single battle.
Right.
And indeed, that is very true. And it was that Reagan buildup. It was the Reagan support of our defense establishment and intelligence community, and indeed State Department. And you think of the extraordinary secretaries of state that he had, in addition to a number of other cabinet officials, and you see a team that was really quite impressive.
Absolutely. General, we've taken a lot of your time. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. It's just been an honor to have you here. Thank you so much.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.